All right. Hey, so it is 6 p.m. my time. Iburo boy, Buche, everybody in Cyberland. Everybody loud. At least I hope so. I'm all doing ilekes coming at you with another great video. Hey, so today I want to kind of just chat with you all right. Hey, on the concept of who is Yemaya, right? Yemaya is known to us to be many aspects, many characteristics, many attributes, right? And I wanted to dive in. Why? Because again, today's her feast day, and how better to honor a different Orisha than to do a live video that we can spread amongst the world, and we can kind of ensure that everybody is tracking and everybody has, different questions. So let maybe we answer some questions. Maybe we get into some deep dive, aspects of things with Yemaya outside of just what Ifa speaks on. But what does Ifa speak on when we talk about numerology? What does Ifa talk about when we talk about astrology? What does Ifa talk about when we talk about science? And that's gonna be something that we have to ensure that we're challenging ourselves as we begin to find our faith, our walk in life, because one of the biggest things that we have as humans is our ability to push forward. We all have an ori, and that ori is only strengthened by the knowledge and the understanding that we receive. Right? This is another reason why Babalaos, as disciples, as speakers for Orumila, we guide people right into a way of life that is Ifa. So with that said, I wanted to kind of just give you guys just a little bit of perspective on what we're going to try to tackle, in this live. I don't have a set time limit here. I'm definitely going to ask questions, but I want to make sure I just threw that out there. So before I begin, I got a couple of my god kids on here during the Zoom. That's the beauty of Zoom, right? We get to have some folks on here, and that helps because they maybe even they have questions and they get to ask live in front of each and every one of you. So I know who is not camera shy from the Ile. So that's always a plus. All right. So with that said, who is Yemaya? Let's just dive right in. When we talk about Yemaya, right, we understand that Yemaya we hold in high regards, right, because of her significance in the nurturing, the protective, and how revered Yemaya is across the globe. This is just not a Lokumi or Yoruba concept that we're traveling with. No, this is something that's worldwide. Yemayá, or a lot of people know her as Yemoja, or you hear a lot of times Limanya, depending on what part of the world you're in, but she's revered, right? And you'll see it in different concepts, like in the Ocha worship, right? Also known as Santeria. We know her, as Yemaya in Candomblé in Brazil, right? We know her as Yemoya, and when you talk about voodoo, when you talk about Haiti, you'll see a lot of concepts of Yemaya just living in a lot of different areas of spirituality that we truly don't, we don't necessarily, not that we don't grasp, but we just don't know where to look, right? So we understand Yemaya, and she's known as the mother of all the Orishas. And I want to explain that because a lot of times we find ourselves, talking about these things, but we don't understand the why. And I think that's important for us to understand. So Yemaya, right? Let's look at some background when we talk about Yemaya. When we talk about Yemaya, we talk about the concepts of a divinity that came from Southwest Nigeria that made her presence known in this world through, unfortunately, the slave trade. And Yemaya particularly survive in many different facets, right? We just explained, globally where you find Yemaya, and then you also kind of understand that Yemaya is held in high regards. And particularly when you look at the coastline of the Gulf of Guinea in Southwest Africa, you start to kind of see that is where, the tribe of Yemaya migrated from during the slave trade. And that's where the concentration of the tribe of Yemaya started to spread its wings across the world. So just to kind of give you guys some concept there on when we're talking about Yemaya, right? So when we talk about Yemaya, right? And let me pause there because I know I got a lot of people that are in the chat. I just want to make sure I tell everybody in there, Buru boy Abucheche, much love to each and every one of you, right? So I know I got Marcella on there, I got Rosie, Brian, Alyssa. Awesome. Hey, so now jumping back in, and again, if you guys got questions, throw it in the chat, and then we'll get after it, right? And that's both in Zoom and YouTube. So when we talk about the concepts of Yemayá, and we talk about that background and where she came from, we understand the survival, right? And we understand the no kidding concepts of Yemayá. But we understand Yemayá, and here's where a lot of confusion that I find in the community is a lot of people try to understand the relationship between Olokun and Yemaya. We understand that Olokun is the original, and I would say still is the owner of the ocean, nonetheless, right? Now, his domain is the deepest depths of the ocean, absolutely, where he keeps the secrets to a lot of different realms of the universe, where he keeps all the prosperity and the riches. And you begin to see that as you begin to be in the faith and you begin to see stories about Olokun and Yemaya. You begin to kind of see where Yemaya was the distributor of the wealth, but where the Yemaya come from. And we have to start from the beginning, right? So I want to jump into a pataki, right? And before I jump into a patakis, in case anybody has any questions there, we'll take a pause for a minute. So I don't see anything in the chat right now on questions. I don't think anybody on Zoom that's not camera shy. So I'm glad I see Leah on there, my real estate agent entrepreneur number one. But you know, we're gonna begin to kind of talk and see how Yemayá is coming out. Hey, Richie Congo, hey, appreciate you. Hey, Buddha boy, Bucheche. Hey, you're my hero, my friend. It says here, Alyssa said, hey, can we leave for Yemayá when we are landlocked? And we're gonna talk about that. In the patakis that I'm gonna talk about, actually in the first couple, you're going to begin to see where Yemaya had to begin to force the streams and the rivers, right, in the world, right, because the world at a certain point was inhabitable. So I say that to say that Yemaya, her influence is everywhere, right? Yes, her domain is the ocean, and we're going to get into that. And yes, if you're landlocked, you want to leave something for her. Do not be afraid to go to a body of water because you have no choice, right? Because that is your option, right? But Yemaya's nurturing concepts, and when we start talking about the scientific side of who is Yemaya, you begin to kind of see at that very moment, right, that Yemaya is everywhere. Okay, so now let's jump right in. Okay, so hey, the first pataki, right, that I wanted to kind of share with you is one that begins to talk about Yemaya and the creation of life, right? And again, this is one of three patakis that I wanted to bring up today, and we're going to get into attributes. We're going to talk about the tools of Yemaya. We're going to talk about her colors. We're going to talk about her numbers. We're going to talk about all types of things, right? But let's dig in with this one. Hey, Yemaya and the creation of life. So in the beginning, right, the earth was barren and was dry, and nonetheless, um, there was no rivers, there was no lakes or oceans, right? Only a vast stretch of lifeless land. The earth was inhabitable, right? It was inhospitable. No living beings were able to thrive. Oloku, the Orisha of the deep abyss, like we mentioned earlier, was the keeper of the world's salty waters. Watched in despair as the earth remained kind of like a devoid of life, right? Despite his immense power, Olokun could not bring life to the barren lands because his waters were too deep, too salty, unable to truly nurture the soil. Yemayá, the Orisha of the surface water and motherhood, was Olokun's sorrow and the earth's plight. Yemayá, feeling the pain of the earth and the sadness of Olokun, decided to act. She knew that the earth needed sweet, nurturing water to sustain life. So Yemayá began to pour out rivers lakes, and streams from her own body, creating the first waterways on this planet. As Yemaya sweet waters began to flow, they met with Olokun salty waters on the shore, merging and creating the perfect environment of life to flourish. Now, let's take a pause there. In Lokumi faith, we talk about La Madre de Do Agua, or we talk about the mother of two waters. This story is one that signifies and begins to highlight, right, the aspects of this spiritual saying of the mother of two waters, right? Because that's Yemaya's function. That's why they say a lot of times that if you can find a river that leads into the ocean, we begin to find the true home of where Yemaya lives. And we also begin to find where the bond between Ochun and Yemaya is created. So I tell you each that because that has always been a topic of discussion in many different circles about what is this Madre de Do Agua, right? And a lot of times you hear the reference of Ochun and Yemaya or Yemaya, but this is where this comes from, was because Yemaya and the creation of life, Pataki. In this particular Pataki, for all my babalaos out there, or people who study Odu Ifa, right? This one comes out of Okanamei. This is an Okanamei Odu. This is a no kidding Pataki from here. So, like I said, Yemaya poured out the rivers, the lakes, the streams in her body, creating the first waterway on the planet. So, as Yemaya's sweet waters began to flow, they met with Olokun salty waters on the shore, merging and creating a perfect environment, right, for flourishing, right, for life, not only in fresh water, but also in salt water. The union of sweet and salty water was the moment of balance and harmony. From from this meeting of Yemaya's nurturing rivers and Olokun's powerful ocean depths, the first forms of life began to emerge. Plants started to grow, fish swarms in water, and the earth began to thrive with vibrant. Right now, again, this is a pataki to understand the relationship between Olokun, Yemaya, and how Yemaya is considered the mother of all things. I tell you this because the creation story you begin to see in many different facets, right? But this is a different angle of the creation from the lens of Oloku as everything else was going on as we know it, with Obatala and Orumila and the Orishas coming down, etc. Okay. Now, Oloku, grateful for Yemaya's intervention, pledged to protect her waters from the deep, ensuring that life on earth will continue to thrive, right? So this pataki not only is symbolizing, right, Yemaya's role as the mother of all life, but also emphasizes the importance of unity and the collaboration between the forces that are seemingly opposite, yet complementary. So now let's reflect on that pataki a little bit, right? And start to ask questions in the chat so we can get deeper into this pataki. But, you know, when we look at the foundation of life, demonstrating that all living things need balance, nourishing, protection, to grow. You know, we honor Yemaya for her contributions. This is one of Yemaya's contributions, right? And again, another contribution that you find in Okanameyi, right? And as you begin to kind of dig deep into that, we got to kind of look at the interpretation. Something that I always tell my Ile, something I always tell everyone else, and that I come in contact with. The patakis have moral and ethical value, and they give us kind of a roadmap, right, to to what is the meaning of life, what is it that we are looking for, and what are those attributes that complement our physical life, right? Because spirituality and physical need to create balance. So let's look at the interpretation, right? So we know that Okanamei is associated with birth and creation of life, right? To bring this full circle with Oduifa. And we know that in Okanamei, this pataki comes out, but particularly it's through the union of opposites, right? Okanamei begins to highlight, the no kidding balance that is necessary and that opposites attract, right? We all have heard these sayings before because we understand that in this Odun, we talk about the cooperation of different forces, like Yemaya, sweet waters, and Olokun's deep oceans, right? And this is just one pataki. We understand that Yemoya, when you break her name down, right? We talk about Yeye, and then we talk mother of the fishes, right? Yemoja, right? Which we talk about Ya, the fish. And we look at that breakdown and we begin to understand that later on, Yemaya becomes, right, the queen of the ocean, right? And there's other patakis that begin to highlight that. But as we begin to continue to dig into this pataki even further, we talk about the emphasis of nurturing and the power of compassion and strength, right? Through coexistence, right? Bringing forth life and sustaining it, right? What better way? But the lesson, in case you haven't truly caught on to it, right, is when nurturers and protectors work together, right? When we talk about the nurturing aspect of who is Yemayá and the protector, or who is Olokun, Olokun's force in that water, right? And as an elder of the Orishas, right? We understand that the importance, right, of things that we need to overcome. Any challenge in this world, right, can be solved, right? You create a world where life can flourish. That means you can create a circle in your family. You can create a circle in your friends. You can create a circle in your community in the same fashion, right? The Odu reminds us, right, the power of unity and the essential role of Yemaya as a life-giving force, right? So hopefully we kind of understand Yemaya, right? The deep connection between why we call her the mother of Orishas and why we say, she is a nurturing life for Earth, right? But we begin to kind of unravel this a little bit. So that's something I wanted to share with you. That's a great pataki to kind of give you some insight on who is Yemaya and her characteristics and what she brings to the table, right? So let me take a look at the chat. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Three mothers. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ah, che. Oh, Buruboya. The womb of the cosmos. Yes. I like it. I like it a lot. Where Buruboya to Janae, Buruboya la corona de Shango, Iburu, Paula, Abdul, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. Opposite attract. No, no, coño, Buruboya. All right, Orisha, the spirits was moving over the water. I like it a lot. All right, guys. Nobody on Zoom got nothing. If nobody on Zoom got nothing, I'm gonna keep it moving. I see a hand up. Steve, give it to me. Steve, give it to me. And welcome to the live. You're famous.
I did put it in the chat, but basically when we say the mother of the Orishas, is that essentially their manifestations in the creation, not the mother in as they existed in Olorun before?
So we begin to say mother of Orisha, right? And I don't want to get out of the topic of Yemaya, but then we got to look at the concepts of what we say iremole, right? The universal beings, the aspects of Olodumare that were created and were able to descend down, right? And then we talk about when they descended down and they had to walk this earth and they had to get their followers and they had to, some folks were actual humans that ascended to Orishas based on their actions in this world. Then we begin to highlight some of those things that we talk about as who really started this life force on this world, right? So Yemaya plays a very crucial role. Lokun plays a very crucial role on how this world was actually going to be inhabited, because at one point it was not inhabited. So we look at Yemaya bringing in that stream, bringing in those lakes in order for us to flourish. Does that kind of make sense? All right, Buru,
Thanks, Padrino.
Demarcus, give it to me. Buru,
Padrino. I got a two-part question for you.
all
So
right.
the first part of the question is not necessary for me, but like what roles does Yemayá play like in the woman body? Because I know that certain Orishas play parts in the body.
Absolutely.
Second part to the
Absolutely.
question is simple item moves that we can leave for Yemayá.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the ID moves and we're going to talk about the scientific part. So I'm going to answer your question a little
Okay.
bit towards the end. So I'm going to hold off on that until we get there, okay? Iburu boy,
Okay.
I got you. Daniela, your hand is up. Give it to me.
Ibaru, Iboya, Ibosheshe,
Iburu
Padrino.
boy.
So I know you don't want to get too far off track, right? But if Yemaya is the mother of Orishas, Obatala is the father of Orishas. And so I was just wondering what the connection is between them, and if you'll get into that.
Yeah. Because it's funny because sometimes we look at mother and we look at father and we try to bring that into a two people did something to create this thing, right? And in this case, right, we need a Yemaya to be the mother, which we consider because of her life force, the water that she began to give in order to nurture the world where it needed to be in order to inhabit, right, humans. And then we look at Obadala, the father. Why? Because Obatala is considered one of the elders. Obatala was the one who molded the clay, right? For Olodumare to come down and breath and put in me inside to those clay figures. So we begin to see the association where a lot of folks actually played some roles, right? They're known for their actions, but it's not necessarily like mother and father, if that makes sense, right? So then when we begin to even dig further, we see that Obatala actually is much older than Yemaya when we talk about the hierarchy of the Orishas, right? Because Obatala, we understand Obatala being one of the elders, Ogun being one of the elders, Olokun being one of the elders, from a very, from the concepts of Olorum, being that they have a concept of Iremole within their pantheon. That means that when they came down, they already came down with a force of Olorum, right? So then we look at Obatala that molded these humans, that some of them actually ascended to become Orishas, and boom, now we got the subject of Obatala. And we say Obatala, he even fathered Orishas technically. Right. So then you start to see that those relationships begin to play a massive role. And the reason why we say the things that we say in this faith. So no, that was a great question. Hopefully I got you there. No, phenomenal question. All right, let's see what else we got here. Oh, okay, now let's get into the next pataki that I want to kind of just chat about. The next pataki I want to give you guys is a pataki that talks about Yemayá and the flood of Olokun. Right, this particular pataki comes from us from Irosum Meyi. Okay, and Irosum Meyi has a lot of significance that I'm gonna share with you after the pataki, so you can begin to associate, why Odu Ifa begins to tell us this creation and tell us all these attributes and who these Orishas are. But let's jump right in. So once upon a time, right, the earth was faced with a great catastrophe, right? A flood of unmanageable proportions, right? The water rose higher and higher, submerging everything in the path. Rivers overflowed, the lakes swelled, the seas raged uncontrollably, right? And all creation, people, animals, plants, they all struggled to survive as the flow waters continued to rise, right? Threatening to cover even the highest mountains. The disaster was not caused by any one single Orisha, but a result of imbalance between the forces of nature. Right now, I take a pause there because we're going to begin to understand Olokun a little bit, right? And there's a lot of variances of this pataki because some of it says that Olokun was the one who started the flood, but in this particular pataki, we're focusing on Yemaya, right? But just understand that those things are there. Meanwhile, in the deepest part of the ocean, Olokun, the Orisha, right? The ocean depths, the mysteries, right? The prosperity, right? Watched in frustration. Because although he ruled the bottomless seas, Olokun had no control over the surface waters, right? Because Olokun gave that domain up to Yemayá to rule. And we understand that the surface water was causing such havoc. So his domain, right, which was supposed to be calm and mysterious and supposed to be very, very, collective, right, was now overwhelmed with raging waters from the above. Despite ruling different realms, Yemayá and Olokun had never truly worked together in this particular part of this Odun, right? So her domain rarely crossed paths with Olokun's domain. The top is the top, the bottom is the bottom. And they were often seen as opposing forces in certain concepts of Odu Ifa. But Yemayá's calm, nurturing surface waters against Olokun's dark, turbulent depths, right? The crisis requires something different. It required the cooperation and the unity. In this pataki, you begin to see how we continue to see the cooperation between Olokun and Yemayá and why those two are so tight together. Driven by the urgency of the situation, Yemayá descended to the depths of the ocean to meet with Olokun, where they met. Olokun's pride as the ruler of the ocean depth clashed with Yemaya's protective instincts over the surface water. Olokun is very mysterious. Olokun wants things the way Olokun wants it. Olokun wants to keep everything almost to a status quo because his secrets are his secrets and none of those will ever get loose. So they argued a little bit because there was an opposing force that was truly interrupting both of their domains. They argued over whose realm was more important and who was to blame for the flood, but the waters continued to rise, threatening to wipe out all life. And they realized that their disagreement was futile. Understanding the dire need for cooperation, Yemayá and Olokun decided to combine their powers to control the floodwaters and restore balance to the earth. Yemayá used control over currents and tides to create powerful streams that would redirect the chaotic water. She carefully guided the water away from the lands and back towards the seas, forming currents that encircled the earth and began to calm the surface waters. At the same time, Olokun utilized his command over the ocean's depth, where he can lower the seafloor, right, creating deep trenches and caverns to absorb the excess water. With each shift, right, of the ocean floor, Olokun drew the unruly water back into the vast depths, containing the chaos with the mysterious underworld that is the ocean. So together, they combined their efforts and it began to take effect. The floodwaters slowly reduced, revealing the land that had been submerged. Rivers returned to their banks, lakes regained their natural boundaries, and the sea calmed the turbulent waves. Life, which had been basically clinging to the highest peak, began to return, right? And it slowly uncovered the land. So, when we begin to look at this, right? And I want to go into the interpretation a little bit. And this is why I wanted to tell you in Odun Ifa Yemoja. And we look at Yemoja, we talk about something very similar in Okaname. We talk about collaboration, balance, and the ability to set aside differences in order to achieve a desired outcome, right? In this case, the harmony, in this case, maintaining life and survival for others other than ourselves. And that's something that Yemoja begins to teach us in Oduifa for all of us. So we obviously understand that, that nonetheless, opposed or different, we can find common ground for the greater good. So in the Odun, right, and in the Pataki, when we start to look at it, we begin to see the illustration, right, between Yemayá and Olokun and the nurturing strength through different, but equally essential, right, the partnership to save the world. Right, so Yemoja encourages each and every one of us, not just children of Yemayá or followers of Yemayá or santeros, santeras, or Orishas, no. Yemoja encourages us to balance all aspects of our life, to understand the cooperation, to bring resolution, even the most overwhelming challenges that we can find ourselves in this world. We have to find that harmony between the contrasting forces and create a foundation for life and prosperity. Right? This is the reason why we always say that Ifa is a way of life. A lot of times we find people that want to categorize it as a religion or a faith, and it's actually just a way of life, right? Because it teaches us how to better be humans in this world so that we could be better to elevate our community, our families, and friends. So I want to kind of share that. So now that I told you Pataki number 2 of 3, right, before we start getting into some of the more juicier stuff, right? Let's see if we got anything here in the chat. Over here on Facebook. Bum, bum, bum. Hey, Budaboya. My first time joining. Thanks for hosting this platform. Ice and Snow Show. I like it. All right, so got nothing over there. So that looks good. I got nothing in Zoom. Perfect. Hey, guys, so we're going to keep it moving. There. All right, so we're going to talk about now another Pataki, when we talk about Yemayá and the relationship of Yemayá and Ogun, right? For many of us, and we're going to talk about the paths of Yemayá a little bit later, but we understand that Yemayá has a path that's called Okuta, right? Or Ogunta, right? Because we understand that there was a relationship between Yemayá and Ogun, where we saw that there was an intimate relationship and they lived together and they were considered, husband and wife. So in this pataki, this one comes from you through Ogundameyi, right? And in this particular pataki, in Mire de Legun, the oracles of the Orishas, we also see it in 3-3, right? And so this story has a lot of complements on both sides of the aisle. Now, this particular story of Yemayá and Ogun. So this one is basically a story Yemayá and Ogun, right? It's basically a tale of love, transformation, and balance, right? But I'm going to give you a little variance at the end because I want you to understand these relationships, right? So in the realm of the Orishas, Ogun was known to be, the god of iron, war, labor, right? He was a formidable warrior. He was feared, by many because of his aggressive and impulsive nature. He had unmatched strength. Right? Ogun lived in the forest at a certain point in time and tirelessly just working, right, with his tools, creating paths, forging weapons. Right? His life was consumed by the fire of his forge. He was a blacksmith, right? And his temper was very hot, right? So Yemaya, on the other hand, was the Orisha, the ocean, nurturing, protector, right? You guys have heard this 100 times. She's known for calming the presence, the deep wisdom, the ability to heal, soothe. Yemaya's energy was opposite from Ogun, right? She flowed gently like the river. She was calm or as beautiful as the ocean waves. One day, Ogun saw Yemaya bathing at the edge of the ocean, right? And he was immediately captivated, right? By her beauty, her grace, the peaceful aura, everything that is Yemaya. And so Ogun, overwhelmed by his feelings, approached Yemaya, declaring his love, However, his approach was intense. It was fierceful, right? Can you think about Ogun, right? If you look at the characteristics and the attribute of Ogun, imagine this big, solid guy that just very impulsive, very aggressive, trying to find a sweet way to say something like to a beautiful goddess like Yemaya, right? So it becomes, to the imagination, right? So Ogun, overwhelmed, right? He approaches, but he's intense and forceful. So reflecting his nature. Ogun's direct and aggressive manner frightened Yemaya. Yemaya's like, oh, wait, what's going on? You a little too close. Weirdo, right? Weirdo alert. And then so accustomed to such, harsh displays of emotion, right? Because, Ogun doesn't know these type of emotions. Yemaya didn't necessarily reject Ogun outright, but instead she tried to calm him, right, with her gentle voice, right, her serene demeanor. As she invited him to sit by the water and talk, encouraging him to release his aggression and listen to his heart. Ogun was very emotionally detached. Ogun was unaccustomed, right, to these types of tender aspects of things. So he felt his his usual rage to begin to dissipate, right, with the water, right, because it's Yemaya's presence. As the days turned into weeks, Yemaya influence began to transform Ogun. She taught him the power of patience and the importance of balance. Yemaya explained that there was strength in stillness, right, and that not every battle needed to be fought with force. Ogun learned to temper his fury, right, with Yemaya's cooling water. No different than when you see an ocean floor and you see that beautiful moon reflecting over the ocean and the ocean is nice and calm, right? That was what now Ogun is feeling. Together, they formed a complementary balance, right? Of power and tranquility. They each learned valuable lessons from each other, right? The relationship symbolizing the merging of fire and water, emotion and aggression, love and patience. Ogun's intense passion was tempered by Yemaya's fluid grace, and together they represented a perfect union of strength and serenity. Okay, now I want to talk to you about one of Yemaya's paths that we're going to talk about later, right? Because this relationship is where it was formed, the avatar or the camino or Yemaya, when we talk about Okuta. And we talk about when Ogun gave Yemaya the sword, the machete. It has an actual name. Sisitar. I'm trying to remember, but it's a one-sided blade. It's curved. But nonetheless, that's what it was. And so now, before I talk to you about Okuta, because I'm going to talk about it later, I wanted you to remember the story that this was the beginning of a love story, right? But not all love stories end with a perfect ending, right? Because we understand that in Yemaya Okuta, Ogun and Yemaya separate, right? Because the dog was what betrayed Yemaya. The dog was the helper of Ogun. The dog at that point is the one who ratted and snitched on Yemaya, right? And this is where the part between Ogun and Yemaya occurred. And we began to see a different side of Yemaya because the complementary forces, right, were no longer together, creating an imbalance, but also created this path of Yemaya that a lot of children that are crowned Yemaya have in Yemaya Okuta, the warrior avatar of Yemaya. But not to get off topic, the Pataki. What is the Pataki trying to tell us? What is the Pataki trying to represent, right? But the transformation, right? Through peace, through patience, through balance, the calming of aggressing forces, right? In the Odun of Ogunda Meyi, I'm going to tell you it's a very aggressive Odun. It's an Odun that is very impulsive. It's an Odun that's very aggressive, right? Because it's in its very name, Ogunda Meji. When we talk about Ogun and his force and characteristics and attributes that live in the family of Ogunda. So the Odun teaches us no different than anybody who has Awofaka, anybody who has Ikofa, anybody who is a Bawalao and has this Odun, right? Anybody who is crowned and has 3-3, right? For their guardian Orisha or even for Ogun, it begins to kind of tell us, hey, you need self-control in your life. You need respect and you need to find harmony in your relationships and especially between contrasting energies. And you'll know what that is and you'll know what that looks like because there's going to be certain people, maybe certain personalities that just get under your skin and you don't know why, right? But that is that nature that we have to continuously get after to ensure that you're seeing what this looks like. That is Ogunda Meiji, right? So, so we talk about the transformation, right? Through love and peace. We understand that this was one of the big sticking points in this pataki, but we also understand the balance of opposites, right? And we talk about that earlier in the other two patakis as well. The way balances, the way that opposites attract, right? Because in this Odun, or Ogunda Mei, and the pataki, we look at the importance of the balance of life. We look at Ogunda or Ogun's fury and his nature is balanced by Yemaya's soothing presence, right? It reminds us that harmony is achieved when opposing forces can respect and complement each other. But this also goes back to something that maybe we were all taught at one point in time where, nurture versus nature, right? Which one overcomes which? And it really comes down to, who you are and where you're moving in life to truly find that balance because nature doesn't necessarily have to always take over. Just because you are one thing and just because your mind is set a certain way, just because you were raised a certain way, just because you believe in something else doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be nurtured to maybe meet in the middle, the cooperation, the collaboration. All those things are beautiful things in order for us to have, right? So the calming of the warrior within for Ogun was vital here, right? And it made him a better Orisha. It made him a better blacksmith. It made him, a better leader when it comes to the cult of or the tribe of Ogun, right? And in the story, right, respect the boundaries in relationships, right? Respect in all relationships, especially between partners and differing temperaments, right? Ogun Dameyi and this Pataki, you don't see, but Ogun has a hard time interacting, right? And then, and we're talking Yemaya because Yemaya was the soothing agent here, right? She was the nurturer here, right? But this is something that we have to take back with us for anybody with the Ogunda sign in their Ikofa or Faka, or maybe in Ocha, if they're crowned and they have a 3-3 somewhere, it just talks about that we have to be able to respect the boundaries, especially between partners, spouses, intimate, partners. Those things are important nonetheless. And then we talk about the guidance of growth, right? Ogun did not have to take that all in. Yeah, Ogun wanted, and Ogun was captivated by Yemaya. But did Ogun have to change for Yemaya? No, Ogun had to make a no kidding decision. And that's where that struggle comes in with Ogunda Meyi. For those that have Ogunda or Ogunda Meyi, those are characteristics. Those who have Ogun as a guardian Orisha needs to always reflect on some of those things because those are some of those challenges and those attributes, right? That's very important. But embrace the lessons of patience, right? Let go of the unnecessary anger and allow love to guide your actions. Very important in those Oduns. But okay, now I done said my piece on this particular Pataki, right? And I'm gonna be done with Patakis, so we don't take all our time on just telling stories. Because you guys know I got Pataki Tuesday, and we'll talk about more Patakis on Tuesdays. But any questions, comments, and concerns? I'm gonna jump over here and I'm gonna look at the chat and see what's going on here. All right, little boy. All right. Lilith of the first house. All right, little boy, bucheche. At Lake Worth Beach, Florida, celebrating Yemayá. No, hey, little boy, that's what you gotta do. Typically on the feast days, it's customary, right? Do something for the Orishas, right? I like to educate and I like to kind of bring the wisdom to the world. Right? I like to give a perspective, right? I'm not saying that I am the end all be all information, right? But I'm merely just another perspective in your growth and development in the faith. Everyone has different perspectives, right? And I like to give back by honoring Yemayá this way, spreading her name. Obviously, I still put my candles down, I still put my moves down. We still light Yemayá up in the house, obviously, right? Because we want some of that nurturing aspects of Yemayá to continue to enlighten us. So that's something that we always remember. So in addition, right, we also understand that Yemayá has roles, attributes, and characteristics. And now here's where I want to get into some of the more details of Yemayá. This is where I want to begin to truly highlight, who Yemayá is. Because this is a lot of information that typically you have heard in one circle or another about Yemayá, but I wanted to begin to now materialize basically what we spoke about, the patakis and everything else, and now let's start to get into some of these other aspects, right? So with that said, everybody's very attentive, everybody's listening. Lilith, we're going to talk about the Adimus and the offerings soon, I promise you. So when we talk about it, I want to make sure that, we look at, Yemayá. When we look at mother of all living things, we kind of understand that. We understand the significance of Yemayá. We understand that Yemayá, when we look at Yemayá, no different than any other Orisha, you got to begin to understand what energy does Yemayá bring into your world. Oh, the energy that she brings to the table is life, fertility, motherhood, right? The nurturing concepts of what it is to bring in and how to nurture and push forward towards a destiny, towards a overcoming, right? Those barriers in life. That's who Yemayá is, right? That's the reason why she governs the waters, right? And when you look at the ocean, right, it's very important to understand that the ocean is covers most of the world. Right? Most of the world is covered by the oceans, which means what? And Yemaya's presence is always going to be there. And that's something that we always got to remember. Now, as we begin to explain further, you know that, you know, the ocean, right, like we already said, is takes on the majority of the world, right? Yemaya embodies the divine feminine force, right? That nurtures and protects, right? And that's something that I think is important for everybody to understand, because at the end of the day, that's truly what we're looking for from Yemaya, right? We need that feminine force in our life. We can never kid ourselves, and we cannot pound ourselves in the chest thinking that, hey, we're good, you know, we're masculine, and this is the way we're gonna go. No, because if you don't have that balance and you don't have that nurturing concept of who is, you know, in this case, Yemayá, then you are missing out because you haven't been listening to any of the patakis. Right? So that's one thing that we gotta kind of begin to unravel. Right? Yemayá is known, right, for a nurturing nature, and that's reflective, right, in her caretaker. And if you look at the Pataki, what did she do? She saw an aggressive force, she nurtured it. She saw that humans were going to drown because the floods were coming, and so that she figured out how to collaborate with a local and bring things down. Right? You see the sustaining aspects of bringing life to the world, and that's what those patakis were designed to tell you, so you can understand the significance of the caretaker, the provider, the guardian, right, of humans. Right? This is the reason why she's invoked. Why? For protection, especially for the women and children, the fertility, the safe childbirth. You see where Yemaya has a strong role when it comes to family, right? And that's why we invoke Yemaya, right? So when we look at the waters that are essential for life, growth, right, renewal, right, those things are what Yemaya's influence brings to the table. Her protective nature is fierce, right? Her defense to her children is fierce. Don't ever get it twisted. Yemaya is like the ocean, and the ocean has many different faces. Sometimes the ocean is nice and calm, and sometimes it's fierce. Sometimes it begins to drive and works with the sister Oya and creates those hurricanes. And when you start to see those combinations, you see a fierce Yemaya. But don't ever get it twisted. Beyond that nurturing, she's a formidable protector, right? When she's threatened, she's going to unleash her wrath, right? And those weapons you see in her very tools that she has. So Yemayá, like many Orishas, has different tools that they have in their tool bag in order to truly highlight their characteristics and their alignment on how they're going to help the humans evolve, how they're going to help the humans push forward. And we already kind of explained the relationship between Ogun and Yemaya is how Yemaya got her machete, right? And that's something we got to remember. So when threatened, she unleashes the wrath, right? And that's something you got to remember. So she's not merely just a mother, but also a warrior, ready to go to fight to protect her followers, right? So that warrior path, Yemaya, Ibu Okunte, or Okute, that's the path. That's the path. Okay, let's see. Again, what is good offering? Seems like as if it's teaching to protect your peace. No, absolutely, Elisa. I mean, I think that's one of Yemaya's true callings, right? To nurture that balance, right? And then for even then, Yemaya teaches us as well that we have to nurture ourselves in order to be strong in this world. We got to be able to protect ourselves as well, right? We're not just looking for sunshines and butterflies and unicorns and rainbows. No, we got to begin to continue to find ourselves and find that balance. So no, that's a good comment, Alyssa. Thank you. Water below, fire above, and air between them. Okay. I would like a little bit more explanation there, but hey, we'll keep going on. All right. So I don't see any hands up. I don't see any questions, comments. So hey, so what do we know about Yemaya? We understand her colors. We understand, her symbols, right, to a certain point. So I wanted to kind of dive into that so we can better understand that a little bit more. So we begin to kind of see the concepts of of her colors. We understand that blue and white is typically very significant, right, to who is Yemaya. You see the followers of Yemaya, you see those who are crowned, with the beads, right? And we understand they're blue and like a clear, right? And that's something that I wanted to kind of talk about because every Orisha, nonetheless, right, has colors. Every Orisha, no different than, what Odu Ifa talks about in the Odun of Obeyono, Obeogunda, right? We begin to kind of see where the colors were began to divvied out amongst the Orishas, right? And the colors of blue and white are very significant to Yemaya. So we understand that blue, symbolizes the ocean, the peace, the healing, while the white represents the purity, the clarity, the protection. Sometimes it's not necessarily white in those colors, right? But you start to kind of see the clear beads, right? And these are central to Yemaya, right? Because they reflect her nature, right? Both nurturing and cleansing, right? This is the reason why that in certain paths and avatars of Yemaya, the beads begin to change, no different like other Orishas. Other Orishas, when you begin to see the avatar and you begin to see the colors, you got to begin to say, wow, those things are changing. And Yemaya has a lot of avatars as well. So when we look at the combination of the blue and the white, right, that mirrors, right, that calming yet powerful nature, right, of the ocean, resonates that tranquility, the depths of Yemaya's spirit, right? So, while symbolizing, along with the purity, protect, and renew. But something that a lot of people don't know is that Yemayá was the one who taught the first Orishas how to actually cast divination with the Orishas. And so the Orishas are very significant to Yemayá. The Orishas symbolize at one point in time when the tribes were together, and we're talking a very long time ago, that Owo, right, the Orishas was actually money. That was actually money that was exchanged amongst the tribes. That was what wealth looked like. So the Orishas symbolize the wealth, the fertility, and the divine connection because that's a tool of divining. Right? They're frequently used in Yemaya's rituals as tokens, for her blessings. Or you see where the Yoruba or the Ates have to cast the shells in order to divine, right? And those things are all there, right? So just food for thought as you begin to kind of see, where are we going with Yemaya? Let's see what's in here. Peace. Do you have to be initiated to honor Yemaya? No. So wild harmony, hey, so on that particular question, no. Every Orisha needs to be honored and anybody can honor them. The point is to understand how to honor them and when to honor them, right? And that's something that's very important, right? Because if you require, let's say, Yemaya's nurturing spirit in your life, then you go to the ocean, right? You find a body of water if you're landlocked, right? And you begin to offer her, which we're going to talk about some of the Adimus, a little later. But you offer in order to bring in that spirituality, bring in that energy into your world. That's the reason why you do the offerings. So absolutely honor Yemayá all day, every day. You don't have to be crowned. You don't have to be initiated, right? Her energy is there for humans, all of us alike. Orishas and how it all connects. Awesome. All right, and then as we continue to push forward, hey, so now we talk about the moon. A lot of folks don't understand the relationship between Yemayá and the moon. We understand that if you look at just the scientific concepts of what the moon creates, let's say a full moon, and how it reacts, right, with the gravitational pull and what it does to the ocean, and we start to look at it almost on a scientific basis, but I'm not going to touch on that just yet. You begin to kind of see that Yemaya's concepts and how the ocean changes is very reflective to the phases of the moon, right? So that's the reason why one of Yemaya's tools is the crescent moon, right? That represents the cycles of nature. It represents the femininity of things, the intuition of things, right? It's closely linked, right? Due to the emotions and the subconsciousness of things, right? Because these are all attributes of Yemayá. Now, when you talk about Yemayá, we also got to begin to kind of look at those characteristics and how they match up to the children of Yemayá, the followers of Yemayá. Because when we begin to see the followers of Yemayá and the children of Yemayá, you begin to see a spirituality that's there, right? That's very intense. Yemayá's children typically are very spiritual. Typically, they even could be good for mediumship if they possess or they've trained themselves hard enough, and they become really good at those things because they have that spiritual intuition at birth. Yemayá is constantly with them and is driving that, through her children. So the moon phases, right? Continuous change, right? The renewal that Yemayá embodies. Because again, the moon controls the ocean tides. The moon can control emotional tides. So it's very important for us to kind of navigate that and kind of understand that. But something that I would tell you that this is another aspects of Yemayá when you look at the moon. The way the moon phases out, right, from a new moon to a full moon, right, you begin to kind of see that nonetheless, her followers have a very hard time sometimes trying to cycle out, right, of these moon phases, right, and it becomes hard. That's why there was an analogy that an elder once told me, and one that I kind of shared with many, is that Yemaya's children, you got to almost imagine walking out of an ocean. You got sand, right? And you're trying to reach solid ground. But that sand, it's a little harder to walk on sand than it is on solid ground, right? And Yemaya's children sometimes have to struggle through the sand to get to the pavement or get to that solid ground. And sometimes that becomes a little bit of a journey. That's why Yemaya's children always have to have a lot of self-control, self-awareness, humility, right? And always take care of their families and their inner circles as the nurturer and the protector so that they can always maintain that balance. All right, another question here in the chat. When you have problems letting go of anger, and we call it Yemayá? Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, it's not just Yemayá when we talk about the concepts of letting go of anger. Obatala is truly your go-to when it talks about letting go of anger. Because Obatala is the one that comes down to create the peace, to create the harmony, but that emotional reaction, right, that we use in our brain in order to drive anger and emotion, right? You got to remember, Obatala is the owner of all heads. Obatala, at a certain point in time, is constantly going to always find himself in a position, right, of being able to push you through some of those thought processes in your mind. So Obatala would be my go-to, not necessarily Yemaya for that particular case. But thank you for asking that, Alyssa. Okay, now we talk about the scimitar. That's the sword, the machete, the scimitar, the oar, other tools of Yemayá. When we talk about the tools of Yemayá, right? And when you look at these tools, a couple of things that gotta be represented here. The machete from Ogun, the scimitar that was used in many different concepts. When we talk about, if you guys ever seen pirate movies, right? It was always used by folks that were traveling the oceans, right? It was a very good tool for a lot of things like cutting the ropes and setting up the oars and whatnot. So the machete, the scimitar, the oars, right, all have reflections on what is called this water. The machete, the relationship with Ogun. But what does it mean? Well, Yemaya's warrior aspect, we talked about that, right? And when we talk about the machete and the scimitar, we talk about the protection. But the oar signifies guidance and direction. When you take an oar and you're rowing a boat, what are you doing? You're turning, you're moving, and that's what the oar represents. That's the reason why certain tools for certain Orishas have to be there. Right? There's no, hey, I'm gonna leave one thing out and I'm gonna get this, or hey, I don't have this anymore, and you don't replace it. This is why Yemaya's kids have to understand all these tools and the reasons why these tools are here. Right? So you understand that the symbology of these tools and what these tools bring to the table, right? Because she both guides and steers her followers. She's steering all of us through life challenges, right? And we need a fierce protector who defends her domain, right? Which we talked about the family and the nurturing, right? So this is why these tools are very important. And you'll see them in rituals, you'll see them during initiation ceremonies, and you wonder why. And now you have a better idea. Everything means something. Baseball bat, Stranger Things signs. Let's go. Weapons of melee. Okay. I'm reading the chat group over at YouTube. All right. Can you share about Dagi where Yemayá uses her warrior tools? Sly, we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. Let's see. Hopefully, we got some time, or maybe I do another pataki on Tuesday. Maybe pataki Tuesday will be a pataki and Yemaya, and maybe that's the one I use, just so I can kind of get down through the agenda that I created and make sure that I kind of give you guys as much as I can. That's funny. All right, Lashiner. She said, "Row, row, row your boat." You're funny. All right. So number 7, right? We understand that Yemayá is known for the number 7, right? And we got to look at the number 7 in many different angles, right? And we're going to talk about the numerology concept of 7. But when you look at 7, right, we understand that that symbolizes a spiritual awakening, right? An introspection, right? A reflection, a search for truth, right? And that is a true fundamental foundation for Yemayá. That's why Yemayá is known for that number, right? You know, this is not something that somebody created one day and said, hey, 7 sounds like a great number. Or, hey, you know what? We're talking about Yemayá and it happens to be the 7th Orisha I'm talking about, so number 7 it is. No, no, no. There's deeper meanings to all of this. And that's something that we got to remember. So the number 7, we understand that that reflects Yemaya's spiritual depths. You know, her connection to that mystical aspect of life represents a lot of the hidden introspective journey of self-discovery, right? We understand that Yemaya's children typically take a while to understand themselves in order to be, you know, better partners in the community and family and friends, because they go through that struggle like I was talking about. You walk out of the ocean, you walk into the sand, and understanding that self-discovery is important. So they can align themselves, right, with life, right? So that's the number 7. And we're going to talk more about that because when you talk about the number 7, we understand that the number 7 in numerology, you start to look at the aspects of spiritual awakening. You talk about the aspects of wisdom, and we mentioned the introspection of things, right? And these are the deep truths of who Yemayá is and what Yemayá is pushing forward for us, right? This is the reason why when you offer things to Yemayá, right, you offer it in 7, right? If you're going to give Yemayá something, make sure it's 7 of something. Right? Make sure if you're gonna give her a bouquet of flowers, make sure it has 7 of maybe one particular flower, and maybe you decorate it with something else. Maybe you want to give her 7 apples, oranges, or anything, right? But particularly Yemayá, for those who are asking about Adimus, she favors the fruits, right? That have a lot of juices in them. Watermelons, cantaloupes, melons, right? Always synchronizing her with her color of the blue and the white, right? Making sure that when you do your offerings, those are things that you got to remember. Something that's a misconception that I want to make sure that I highlight here is just because we say number 7 doesn't mean that you're going to light 7 candles, because I've seen, you know, a lot of things with that, and that's not a good idea. So don't do it. You stick to the 1 candle or the 2 candles, depending on what your house guides you through. But typically the 2 candles is reserved for the priests and the priestesses of the Orishas, or someone who has Awofaka or Ikofa, but they do that for Orumila. But for the other Orishas, if you're not crowned or you're not a Babalao, then stick to 1. But we start to kind of go even further down this, right? So then now you guys got an understanding about the number 7. You got a kind of an understanding on the Adi moves. On the Adi moves, I guess I will continue there. I would say that, you know, we don't use honey with Yemayá. We use molasses with Yemayá. So that's another very important part that needs to be understood. So when you talk about the number 7, understanding that when you go there, you want to kind of open up that door, you know, to Yemayá, and you want to give thanks to her, right? This is not just, hey, I'm leaving you something so you can give me something back. No, you go to her house, you introduce yourself, right? You give her 7 pennies, and, you know, you open up and you say, Yemayá, I'm giving you this offering so you can bring me the love and the peace and the tranquility. Not to mention prosperity, right? Because she understands the secrets of Olokun, right? So then she could begin to bring some of that into your life. All right, let's see. Molasses, Lashner, molasses. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about Yemayá, but let's take it to a different level, right? When we talk about Yemayá, we talk about the ocean depths, right? And this is where the number 7 comes back, right? Because number 7, as you dig even deeper in numerology, we understand there's mystery behind it, right? It represents the unseen, right? It represents the hidden. Which now you go back to the relationship between Yemayá and a local, right? And you kind of fuse them together, right? So what does that mean? That means that Yemayá challenges us, and Yemayá's children are challenged with exploration beyond the surface. You can't take things for face value. You got to dig deeper, right? And those are things that Yemayá begins to tell us to do. Her energy helps us uncover those depths of problems or concerns or mysteries in our life, right? And that's through personal and spiritual transformation. And that's something that's very important. And as we begin to kind of even go further in, we got to let's look at Yemayá from a scientific perspective, because I think that's important. I think we got to understand some of the biological and psychological concepts that Yemayá brings to the table as we start to kind of really get into Yemayá, right? So, let's see. Got more questions in here. 7 and not 8. 7 and not 6. 7 is the number, 100%. Right? Can Yemayá be found in the bracket? Oh, all right, you deleted it. It's all good. All right, I'll get back to you. All right, so let's talk about it, right? Yemayá from a scientific lens and a medical lens. I think that's very important for us to understand. A lot of times we look again at our spirituality and we don't really, take into account how much it truly touches our life, right? And how much it touches science, how much does it touch astrology, how much does it touch, medicine? And those things are important, right? So we're going to talk about that. So Brian, yes, can Yemayá be found in the bracket waters of the intercoastal? Absolutely. Yemayá, you begin to see that I started out explaining that she's the one who opened up all the waterways. She then gave those domains to Ochung, but she is still found between the waterways and the ocean, right? But her energy still lives there. Ochung and Yemaya's relationship is completely binded. So you go through one to get to the other is absolutely acceptable. So good question, Brian. So when we look at Yemayá and the science and medicine, right? So let's go into that. So biologically, we understand that water is the virtue of life. We understand that the human body has 60% of water, right? Which plays a crucial role in what, right? So the body can't function, right? The cellular functions of your body are not going to do what it needs to do without the water, right? Water cools you down, right? That's why we always tell you make sure you hydrate, right, in those hot days, right? And it also detox you, right? We live in a time, that you find a lot of preservatives and a lot of different things in our foods and our water and different things, and you got to make sure that you go back to that source and you detox yourself. But that's what the function of Yemayá does, right? Trying to balance your body and regulate your temperature, making sure your cellular functions are all moving in the same way. And it by any chance, if you even think about it, right, it's all waterways anyway, streams of veins and arteries, all trying to move and pump. No different than the world moves, and the same concept when you talk about the bodies of water and the rivers and the streams. Right? That's what Yemayá brings to the table from the science of water perspective, right? So Yemaya's connection of water is like life sustaining, right? So she embodies that renewal, that balance, right? And that's very reflective. So then, let me see, I got more questions here. Paul, yeah, being landlocked where I'm at currently, being from the East Coast, one of the things I miss is being able to drive to the beach and finding a peace and calm. And absolutely, I'm telling you, Yemayá does that. Yemayá would absolutely, unleash that. Yemayá's oceans, and the blood of our body. Absolutely. And when you begin to kind of see those things play themselves out, we begin to kind of see that more. So now let's look at Yemayá from a psychological effects of water. All right, so being near water, to go back to the point that I got from Paul on YouTube just now, he goes to the ocean to find that peace and that calm. But there is a no kidding what psychologists, or psychology would call the blue mind theory, right? That talks about that being near water significantly, right, or scientifically, right, because this is proven, has shown to reduce stress. It improves your moods, right? It enhances mental clarity, right? So you are aligning yourself with Yemaya's calming and healing presence, right? That's the explanation, right? But the therapeutic effects we cannot deny. And that's why it's important for us to always remember we got to look at all these different aspects, right? Because the therapeutic effects of water environment resonates with Yemaya's soothing energy, right? And the rituals often involve water elements, helping us connect with the ocean's tranquility, and we find balance. That's the reason why a lot of your initiations and your consecrations, right? One of the biggest things is omi tutu, fresh water, right? And we are always on top of that because that is a nurturing concept for life sustaining anything in this world. Got a question in the chat. Is Yemayá the unconscious mind? Sly, so great question. Thank you for sharing. Yemayá is not the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind, or when we try to talk about, even the chakra balancing, and we talk about third eye, and we start to go into all these different patterns, or different faith systems or practices, we understand the unconscious section of your mind is held by a little light, right? So if you open up science books or you try to, go into that neurological side of things, right? We understand that spark of light, that light that sits in the middle of your brain, that unconscious part, right, is actually your ori, right? Your ori is what truly manifests your destiny, where you're going, how you're getting there, right? And you go through a lot of ceremonies and you go through head cleansings and whatnot. Why? Because we are trying to wake up that third eye, open up that spiritual world for you so that you can embrace some of this goodness from different Orishas, like we're talking about Yemayá. So hopefully that helps you. Can you speak Yemayá Okuto and Kuta? Yes, yes, I can. And I will. And we'll get there. All right. Now, going back, right? We understand the psychological side of it, right? So now let's talk about the subconscious. Being that, I got it on YouTube just now, right? The unconscious mind. The ocean is a metaphor. Think about it like this, but it's a metaphor of what? The subconscious mind, right? Representing the deep, right? And the hidden parts of the human psyche, right? And that is something that's very interesting because Yemayá influences, right? Not that it is, but influences help, you know what I mean, to explore the inner world, uncovering the emotions and the insights that are buried beneath the surface, right? Again, the relationship between Olokun and Yemayá. This is why when we look at Yemayá, we look at her in many different facets. So I really like the comment on YouTube on the unconscious mind. But now let's talk about the healing and cleansing properties of Yemayá. When we talk about the healing and the cleansing properties, we understand that in medicine today, you can go out to any city right now, your town where you're in, and the people are using hydrotherapy, right? They use water for what? They use water for pain relief. They use water for relaxation. They use water for rehabilitation. And, even got people that are doing water aerobics and people are getting it in, right? And those are all good things. Those are all beautiful things, right? But those are things that are medically used based on the art of medicine, right? And science that has proven those are things that are the water is good for, right? So Yemayá, is already working on cleansing and spiritual purification, and we mirror those in even our therapeutic efforts, right? But nobody ever gives credit where credit is due. And that's the reason why we got to talk about Yemayá. That's the reason why we got to get into this, right? So just so you can kind of understand those healing properties, both physically, but also spiritually, right? The cleanse of negative energy and promoting the emotional healing and fostering the renewal. Those things are important. All right. Now, got another question here. Let's see. Kuto, yep. Yep. Okuto no. Yeah. Okay. I think I know what you mean, Queen. Queen, I'm gonna get to your question when I start talking about the avatars. Absolutely. She is the light that came out of the ether, marvelous light, primordial light, wisdom. Hey, Miami. Or hey, mommy. All right. Hey, beautiful, beautiful. All right, we're gonna keep pushing through. Hey, so I don't have no more questions there. I think everybody's good on questions. All right, we're gonna keep moving. Hey, so now let's talk about the offerings, the rituals, some of the devotions that we see that people do towards Yemayá. That's important, right? I know we talked about the traditional offerings, right? The watermelon, the honey, molasses, right? Again, we use molasses. Honey has a property that is used during ceremonies that is important. But for those who are not priests and priestesses, stick to the molasses. We understand that Yemoya, the mother of all fishes, you can offer fish, right? Because it's a sincerity of the offering of recognition as the mother of all the fishes, the mother of the ocean, the mother of life, right? We give blue and white flowers to represent her colors. You do the seashells, absolutely. And you offer all these things, right? Because again, you do it in seven in order to symbolize that nourishment, that abundance. But we also want to honor her. And I want to make sure that when you are doing any type of, offering, that you're doing it from the heart, right? Be very cautious about, making deals or trying to ask the Orishas that, hey, if you give me this, I'm going to give you this. Or, hey, I'm giving you this so you can give me this. Trust me, the Orishas are going to bless you nonetheless. Don't corner yourself in greed, or don't corner yourself in trying to exploit the Orishas, because those things can lead to other things. Eshu is always watching. So, a lot of people at a certain point in time find themselves creating altars. And I'm all about it. If your heart is set and you want to build an altar and you want to put your statues up and all this goodness, I want you to understand that that is a representation. Right? This is the reason why I wanted to talk about rituals and devotion, right? And a lot of people want to create that space and want to honor them, especially folks that maybe understand that Yemaya is your guardian Orisha, and you feel the energy and the love and the devotion to do something. That's okay. Just make sure that you're setting it up with the things that Yemaya is, that Yemaya represents, making sure that all those elements are there, but understanding that that is a representation and a devotion to Yemaya, but it's not Yemaya, right? Yemaya, you always want to go back to her life force, her place in nature, in order to truly draw in that energy that you're truly looking for. So, not saying that it's not something that you can't do, but I am saying that I want you to make sure that you're balancing that out with the sacred place, so that you can definitely benefit from Yemaya's energy. Now, when we begin to kind of continue to go forward, right, we understand that there's a lot of different things that can happen with Yemaya, right? And we understand that Yemaya's influence in spirituality is there. We understand that Yemaya, for all my feminist people out there, feminine empowerment, right? Yemaya is there. Yemaya is in the forefront, right? Yemaya embodies the divine feminine, representing strength, intuition, right, and nurture, right, and that empowerment, right, to seek and reclaim the power, particularly for women. Yemayá is a strong advocate. Right? All women should have a place in their hearts for Yemayá. You can be a daughter of Ochun, but you gotta look at Oya. You could be a daughter of Oya, but you gotta look at Yemayá. You gotta find a place for Yemayá regardless of who you are. Big Daddy, hey, boro boy, bucheche. Okay, so we begin to kind of find, some of those things. And I would tell you that, Yemaya's lessons, I think to all, but particularly the women, I think is very important. self-care, protection, right? Emotional resiliency, right? And she teaches us to honor our boundaries, right? Nurture ourselves, stand strong in our truths. And I think that's very important for us to hear nowadays, especially based on the world climates, right? And torn communities and people, looking at the things that are different versus the things that are similar, right? And we need to grow more in this world, right? So I love Yemayá and I love what she represents, and I hope you guys take this heart. Okay, so now let's push a little further, right? So, how is Yemaya reflected in today's world? And I think that's something that I don't think we talk about enough, right? And I want to talk about that just a little bit more. But let me see and make sure I got all the questions going on here. The chat over here on Zoom. I neglected you guys in Zoom. Sorry, because I was looking for the hand to go up. Oh no, Buddha boy. Let's see. Much needed study lesson on Yemaya. No, Buddha boy Joel. The Orisha feast days consecrated. Are the Orishas feast days consecrated? When and how were the days chosen? Is why? Is there a specific reason for the day? So yes. So there are specific reasons for the Orishas. Now, talking about the dates on the feast days for Steve, um, the feast days, you're going to find many different variations of the feast days, right? We all understand that during the slave trade, right, and we started to mask and synchronize, right, Orishas with saints, and we started to play this game, right? And then when you look at Catholicism and you look at the saints, in particular, Yemayá, la regla de la Virgen de Regla, or Virgin Mary, right? That's how we look at, as a synchronization in Yemayá during that slave trade, during that masking period, right? And so therefore they took those days, those holy days, right, to represent their martyrs and like, let's say Catholic Church or Christianity, and they took those days of honor and then they just kind of used it with the Orishas. That's one version. That's the reason why some of the feast days you're going to find are actually synchronized with saints. This is a Yemayá's feast day based on the fact that we just had a full moon or a new moon, and this one I don't want you to quote me on, that just transitioned us into autumn, that just transitioned us into fall, right? So then that is why Yemayá becomes that boundary, that border, the river, the ocean, the end of summer, and the beginning of autumn, right? And we look towards those phases. And so Yemayá's feast day was typically always in between there, right? And then someone eventually slapped a date in between the intent. And this is where we are at, right? So it's not that, hey, somebody found a calendar 1,000, 2,000 years ago when they weren't following this calendar. Well, no, they followed the stars, they followed the moon, they followed the seas and the oceans, and that's how they got to where they got to. But that's a great question. I think I already answered your question there, Ashley. They're synchronized with the day of the associated saints. No, yes, yep, and I think I already answered that one somewhat. No, perfect. So we have different days, right? Daniela, so yeah, so in Isha, believe it or not, some of these dates that you see that are not synchronized, but they still sit in Lokumi, are actually some of those days that you actually find in Isha as well. But now Isha is very interesting because some days are not. Why? Because the climate is different, right? So therefore, people had to do, an analysis. People had to go to Cuba. Let's just say, use Cuba an example as one of those truly, meccas that really, gravitated towards the faith, and they had to look and see what is that astrological concept, right? Of what Yemayá represents, and when is this going to be a good time, and when should we represent her? And they had to go through some of that math because somebody, I could only imagine. I'm just sitting back thinking, I'm like, if I was a slave and I was thinking, man, if Yemayá is this, how come we're celebrating her over here when it technically should be over here? Because what we're looking for is the boundaries between the end of summer and the beginning of autumn, so that we can begin to harvest, and understand that we're at a starting point where we need to start putting our harvest together because the winter is coming. And what if it's a long winter? And, and you start to go through those processes. And I can only imagine if I was a slave back in the day, and you're trying to better understand now, the dates kind of shift, right? Because in Africa, or specifically in Nigeria, if we want to kind of hone in on Isheshe, that climate is different, right? No different than, they use Oyo Festival, you got Ochun's Festival, you got the Ogun Festival, and those things begin to manifest. But great, great, great question. If I'm not mistaken, they don't really have feast days like we do. Correct. They have festivals. So Isheshe focuses on festivals, not necessarily feast days, right? And they're always about the principal Orishas, right? That's why you don't necessarily see an Orumila feast day, for example, right? In Lokumi, we like to polish everybody off, right? And we like to give a little love to everybody because hey, what better way? We feel like if we give everybody love, we're gonna get a lot of love back. But in Isheshe, they focus on a lot of the principles, right? But Isheshe also focuses on a lot of the other Orishas that we don't focus on, that never necessarily migrated over that so therefore we never really incorporated. No different on the Oduduwa's feast day. They actually have an Oduduwa festival that they hold in Nigeria, an Olokun festival they hold in Nigeria. And you'll see where some that we do don't do versus what they do don't do, and a lot of it has to just do with looking at the concepts of astrology, numerology, and what is the characteristics and the attributes of what we're trying to accomplish in order to match where the world is going, where the stars are taking us, and boom, then we pick a date. So it's very, very beautiful when it's all said and done. All right, let's see. I got everybody over here. Everybody's still good here. Okay. So everybody looks good over here on Cyberland. I like it. I don't see any more questions there. So now let's talk a little bit about the relevance of today, right? When we look at Yemaya, when we look at today, right? We understand that today is a very fast-paced world, right? Yemaya teaches us a lot of Yemayá teaches us a lot about the balance, the nurturing, the protection, right? And this is more relevant than ever. And when you start looking at that, you got to start to kind of really highlight, as humans, that we can't necessarily get caught up in the moment. Right? We got a lot of type of, I want to say, emotions that are flying, and when we can really call on to that nurturing spirit, it is Yemaya. We got people that are upset with politics. We got people that are upset about wars and conflicts, in distant lands. We got people that are upset with the system. There are people that are upset with government. Everybody's upset, right? And no one's truly finding some of those inner pieces, right? And I think it's important for us to remember that. So connect with Yemaya. Find that comfort, find that guidance, you know what I mean? And strengthen yourself with the ancient wisdoms, right? That Ifa gives us every day. And we got to apply those customs to these challenges. Something that I said I was going to talk about and I didn't touch on was the astrological side of things. When we talk about Yemaya, right? We talked about the moon, right? But we also know that Yemaya is a water sign. So for all the water signs out there, right? Yemaya has a special place in your heart, right? Because when we look at those water signs, and we look at what the concepts is of Yemayá, we find ourselves looking at different avenues, right? So, it's very important for us to always kind of honor those Cancers, those Pisces, right? Scorpio is big in Yemayá's, pantheon of things. And for those who don't know, right, just to talk a little bit about astrology. Not that I'm an expert on this. I got tons of guys that can talk circles around me, because astrology is not my strong suit, but I like to dabble a little bit, right? When we look at Cancer ruled by the moon, and we look at, Cancer's maternal, care, the emotions, the depths, right? Those are the qualities that Yemayá truly navigates through, right? And so it's that nurturing aspects of things, right? And then when you look at Pisces, for example, it's ruled by Neptune, right? And Pisces symbolizes what? But that spiritual depth, that compassion, the dreams, right? That mystical realm and subconsciousness, which is why, when we talk about Yemaya, we talk about the spirituality, those mediums, right? And why, Yemaya's children are so close to things, right? When it comes to that spiritual realm and why they become good mediums and spiritualists. And so then, that connective emotion, intuition of the unseen forces, right? Of the universe is very keen in Pisces. And then you look at, the Scorpios of the world. When you talk about Scorpio, right, we sometimes look at some of that fierce aspects of things, but, ruled by Pluto and Mars, the transformation of intensity, the ocean being calm to the ocean roaring. Right? Those are all things that we always got to remember. And when you look at that, Yemayá becomes a protector. We talked about, her warrior path. And that's something that, I'm going to talk a little bit about because I remember I said I was going to talk about paths and I didn't talk about paths yet. So you look at some of those astrological themes, right? With Yemaya's fierce past or Yemaya's, connection, to deep emotions and intuition, or maybe it's just the nurturing aspects, right? Of those three, particular astrological signs of Cancer, Pisces, and Scorpio. But what is it truly trying to tell you when you try to kind of combine them, right? It's just, Yemayas often deals with the themes, right? And those themes, whether you look at astrology in the fourth house or you look at astrology in the eighth house. I know my goddaughter, Jamaica, is probably proud of me right now because I hope I said that right. The fourth house, when we talk about the home, right? The roots. And the eighth house, we talk about transformation and rebirth. So we look at, the balance of opposites, right? We look at, the balance of the emotional depth, which is the water, the aggression, which is fire, and we begin to kind of play that role. But all right. I'm off of astrology because I feel like someone's gonna ask me a question. I'm gonna go, I don't know nothing. All right, so let's see if I got anything over here in the chat. I don't think I got anything in the chat group over here. So boy. All right, I think the chat I think people are like, I'm good, just listening. All right, make sure I got nobody over here in this chat group over here. All right, nope, perfect. All right, so now let's talk about the paths of Yemayá. So we have one particular path for Yemayá I'm going to talk about, which is the Achaba, right? And I'm going to try to describe this as best as I can. So Achaba is one of the eldest of Yemayá's paths, right? Ibu Achaba is depicted as the first wife of Olokun, right? And owns the anchor of the sea. So again, we begin to kind of see the aspects of Achaba. Ibu Achaba is when Yemayá, as the wife, was kind of the custodian of Olokun's secrets, right? And understood Olokun's secrets. That's why in Ibu Achaba, this is a path that needs to truly be that symbolizes a lot of stability and emotional grounding, because the responsibility of the depths of the ocean that Ibu Achaba, comes with is very important. So something to kind of remember as you kind of go through it. And then when we start to look at other, paths of Ochun, you got Okute, right? Or Ogunte, right? And this is one of the paths that we talk about, where is the warrior aspect of Yemayá, right? Married to Ogun, known for the combative nature, as she wields the machete, right? And this particular Yemayá is one that doesn't necessarily live in the ocean. This is a particular path, the one that transits between the ocean and the woods, right? Because she was again married with Ogun. So there are things that you have to understand as a child of Yemayá that's crowned, and now you understand you're a Okunte, and there's certain things that have to happen with you, and things that you have to honor a little bit differently to align with Yemayá, right? So food for thought there, right? Because I'm gonna tell you that Avatar particularly is tough. It's very rebellious. You know what I mean? And that's something to always remember. And then when we talk about uh, Mayelewo, Ibua Mayelewo, is another path to Yemaya. And this one particularly lives in the middle of the sea. This is the one that controls the currents of the oceans, right? So this particular path of Yemayá is one that's associated a lot with wealth and the fluidity of the waters. Why? Because when boats and cruise ships and whatever has to, take things from point A to point B, when we talk about goods and spices and whatnot, nonetheless, we found ourselves, understanding the trade and the prosperity of things by way of the water. So this particular, pathway of Ochun lives in that particular part of the ocean, right, and controls the current. So that's a very good sign. That sign is that path. I mean, and that avatar is really good for money. For wealth, for commerce, for business. And that's an energy that resides there. So for those, children who have that particular path, very beautiful thing. And then when you talk about Buaganya, this is that's when I always try to better understand because I want to explain it better. Because it's a very complex path for Yemaya. Ibuaganya carries a mask, right? And was, I guess, dictated, I guess is the right word, to be the messenger of Olokun, right? And in this particular, path, this is a representation of restriction because she was dictated and she was kind of binded as Olokun's messenger, but also she was the one who kind of was the enforcer for Olokun, right? So in Ibuaganya, we begin to understand that it's representing punishment, restrictions, and the weight of responsibilities, right? So people with this particular path in Ibuaganya, you begin to find that they need to really understand their obligations in life, understand that they're aligning themselves with obligations. They can't be so sporadic all the time. They have to really plan things out. So those who just want to just, hey, let's just go somewhere for the heck of going somewhere because we got nowhere to go. Those are not characteristics of this particular avatar because this particular avatar has very specific purpose in life, right? So food for thought there. And then you got Ibu, Okutu. Okutu is known for the sea of particularly blood. I know it's gonna sound a little crazy, but a lot of wars and a lot of things have happened in the ocean. A lot of people were buried, right, or were in certain cultures, right. You send the dead bodies across the water, right, and sometimes it just floats away. Sometimes they burn it. Sometimes they do a lot of different things. But this path reflects Yemayas, and this is another path of her warrior concepts, where she presides over the battles of the sea. She presides over, if we had to do modern day, we would look at the Navy, right? We would look at those Navy battles and those violent encounters or incursions, right, in ocean. And this is a particular, path of Yemaya. She begins to look at her domain a little bit differently, and she begins to find herself there trying to do the right thing, right? So then you got another path that I'll talk about, and I'll probably leave it there. Is Yimbo. Yimbo is the pure concepts of Yemaya. Yemaya Yimbo is considered, this is the one that's actually considered the mother of all the Orishas. Right? This is the one that's connected to the calm seas. This is the one that's connected to the beginning of life. This is the one from the Pataki that I first read. Right? She embodies that pure nurturing aspects, right? And ensures that things begin to flow. So hopefully you guys got all of that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I know I've been talking a lot and for a very long time, right? And I just want to kind of just make sure that I captured everything that I can to honor Yemaya. Yemaya has a very, very sweet spot in my life, and I love Yemaya very much, and I think she has a lot of value to the world. So I think that is something that we just got to kind of reflect on. So I'll do one last scan here. Pum, pum, pum. I don't think I see anything there. So, hey, with that said, Iburu boy, Ibu Cheche. I hope everybody has a blessed one. And with that said, everybody have a great night. And my farafung Yemaya and mofuri bale to all the children of Yemaya.